Linda called me a land thief in front of the entire community. I inherited 1,500 acres from my grandfather and thought the hardest part would be learning how to manage the ranch. I was wrong. Before I could even unlock my own gate, the sheriff was waiting for me beside an HOA president who claimed I was trespassing. Then came the fines, the threats, the lawsuit. But buried inside an old envelope was a secret nobody in that subdivision saw coming. And when the truth finally arrived, it showed up in every mailbox at the same time. If you've ever seen power used the wrong way, stay with me, because this story only gets bigger from here. And before we get started, if stories about ranch life, property rights, HOA drama, and ordinary people standing their ground the right way are your kind of stories, take a second to subscribe. There are plenty more roads like this one ahead. The first thing I saw was the gate, not the mountains behind it, not the lake shining beyond the cottonwoods, not even the cattle moving slowly across the lower pasture. Just the gate. The same iron ranch gate my grandfather had installed nearly 30 years ago. Same weathered posts, same rust-colored hinges, same brass plate stamped with a single word. Mercer. I parked my pickup on the gravel shoulder and sat there for a moment, with both hands on the steering wheel. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been sitting in a probate attorney's office in Denver, learning that my grandfather had left me 1,500 acres of Colorado ranch land. 3 weeks wasn't enough time for that fact to feel real. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, had owned this land longer than I'd been alive. He'd spent 50 years refusing offers from developers, investors, and resort companies who wanted pieces of it. Now it was mine. The deed sat inside a folder on the passenger seat. I glanced at it once, then grabbed my keys and stepped out of the truck. The gravel crunched beneath my boots. A small herd of cattle grazed beyond the fence line. The lake stretched across the western edge of the property, calm and silver beneath the morning light. Everything looked exactly as it had during my last visit before Grandpa passed away. Quiet, unchanged, permanent. At least that's what I thought. I had taken maybe 10 steps toward the gate when I heard tires on gravel. A vehicle approached fast. I turned. A county sheriff's SUV rolled up beside my truck. Then another vehicle followed behind it. A white luxury SUV. The sheriff's vehicle stopped first. Sheriff Tom Raines climbed out. I knew him by reputation. Most people in the county did. Solid man. Fair man. The kind of sheriff who listened before he spoke. That was why I was surprised when he looked uncomfortable. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Before either of us could say anything else, the driver of the white SUV stepped out. A woman in a tailored blazer and expensive sunglasses. Confident, purposeful, already irritated. She walked toward me like she'd been waiting for this moment. "That's him," she said. Not hello, not good morning, just that's him. Sheriff Raines sighed. "Mr. Mercer?" "That's right." The woman folded her arms. Linda Whitmore. The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. I'm president of Crest Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. That explained the SUV. The subdivision bordered part of the eastern ranch boundary. I'd driven past it on the way in. Stone entrance signs. Manicured lawns. Expensive houses lined up along roads that used to be grazing fields decades ago. Still didn't explain why she was standing at my gate. She pointed toward the access road beyond the fence. "You're not authorized to be here." I blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The road beyond this gate is HOA-controlled property." I actually thought I'd misheard her. I looked at Sheriff Rains, then back at her. This ranch belongs to me. It does not. She said it immediately, without hesitation, without doubt. As though she'd practiced the sentence. The association has authority over this area. We've maintained it for years. I glanced toward the gate, toward the brass plate carrying my family name, then back to her. I inherited this property 3 weeks ago. Linda smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind people use when they've already decided they're smarter than you. People claim ownership of things all the time. The statement was so ridiculous I wasn't sure how to answer. Sheriff Rains cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore contacted my office yesterday. Because he's attempting to access HOA property, she interrupted. I looked at the sheriff again. Did anyone check the county records? Linda answered before he could. The county records are irrelevant. That got my attention. Irrelevant. Not wrong. Not disputed. Irrelevant. Interesting choice of words. She took a step closer. The Homeowners Association has maintained this access road for years. Maintaining something doesn't mean owning it. Her jaw tightened. For the first time, the confidence slipped slightly. Only slightly. But I noticed. People who truly own something usually mention deeds. Titles, records, legal descriptions. She hadn't mentioned any of those. Only maintenance. I looked down the road running through the eastern section of the ranch. The road curved toward the subdivision entrance, toward Crest Hollow Estates, toward something I hadn't yet examined closely. Then I looked back at Linda. Who owns the land under the road? She paused. Just long enough, then recovered. The HOA controls it. That wasn't what I asked. Who owns it? Another pause. Longer this time. Sheriff Rains shifted his weight. Linda didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward my truck. You need to leave. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. I was standing at the entrance to property that had belonged to my family for half a century. And a woman I'd met 60 seconds earlier was ordering me off it. The strangest part wasn't her confidence. It was how completely certain she seemed, like she'd never once considered the possibility that she might be wrong. I reached into the cab and picked up the folder containing my inheritance documents. Linda's eyes followed the movement. What is that? Paperwork. You don't need paperwork. I looked at her. That sentence hung in the air. You don't need paperwork. The president of an HOA talking about a property dispute. And paperwork wasn't important. Interesting. Very interesting. Sheriff Rains finally stepped between us. Maybe everybody should slow down. Linda looked annoyed. I looked curious. Because something wasn't adding up. Not even close. People don't usually challenge ownership claims this aggressively unless they believe they have something solid behind them. A deed. An easement. A title transfer. Something. But every answer she'd given felt incomplete, like a person repeating information she'd never personally verified. I slipped the folder back under my arm. Then I nodded. All right. Linda looked surprised. You're leaving. For today. A flash of victory crossed her face. She thought she'd won. Sheriff Rains looked relieved. I turned toward my truck. opened the driver's door, and paused. One final glance at the road, the subdivision, the gate, the land. Something about the whole situation bothered me. Not because I'd been challenged. Because Linda Whitmore seemed absolutely convinced she was right. People that confident usually have a reason. The question was whether the reason actually existed. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, Linda stood beside the gate with her arms crossed, watching me leave. Certain she'd just protected HOA property. What she didn't know was that I planned to spend the rest of the day pulling every document my grandfather ever kept about this ranch. Because if there was one thing Walter Mercer taught me, it was simple. Land doesn't argue. Paper does. And somewhere in my grandfather's files, I had a feeling there was a piece of paper that would explain exactly why the HOA president was so confident standing on land that had never left my family's hands. Or reveal something far bigger. Either way, I intended to find it. My grandfather never threw paperwork away. That fact became obvious the moment I unlocked the ranch house and stepped into his office. 3 metal filing cabinets lined one wall. Bankers' boxes were stacked beneath the window. Shelves held decades of binders labeled in neat black marker. Taxes, water rights, livestock permits, boundary surveys. Every year of his life seemed preserved in paper. I spent the next 4 hours digging. Not because I knew what I was looking for, because I knew something was wrong. Linda Whitmore hadn't acted like someone making a guess. She'd acted like someone repeating a story she'd heard for years. Stories usually start somewhere. The question was whether the paperwork agreed with the story. By early afternoon, I'd built 3 piles on the desk. Property records, subdivision documents, old correspondence. The subdivision pile caught my attention first. Most of the documents dated back more than 30 years. Before Crest Hollow Estates existed. Before the luxury homes. Before the entrance signs and HOA newsletters. Back when the eastern section of the ranch had still been open pasture. I opened a faded folder labeled Eastern Development Agreement. Inside were letters between my grandfather and a developer I'd never heard of. Most were routine. Negotiations, construction schedules, road access requests. Then I found an envelope tucked into the back. Unlike everything else, it had been sealed. My grandfather's handwriting covered the front, open if questions ever arise about the East Road. I sat down, suddenly very interested. The envelope contained a single document, 21 pages, county stamped, recorded, signed. I read the first page once, then again, then a third time, because what I was seeing didn't make sense. Not at first. The document was an easement agreement, 32 years old. The developer had been granted access across part of the Mercer Ranch for construction and future subdivision use. The legal description matched the same road Linda had claimed belonged to the HOA, the same road Sheriff Raines had stood beside that morning, the same road I'd been ordered to leave. I flipped to the final pages. That's where everything changed. The easement wasn't permanent. It had an expiration clause, a specific expiration clause. No ambiguity, no loopholes, no automatic extension. The agreement terminated unless renewed through recorded filing. I checked the date, then checked it again. The easement had expired 8 months ago. 8 months. I leaned back in the chair. The room suddenly felt very quiet. If this document was still valid, Linda had a point. If it wasn't, then the road belonged entirely to the ranch again. I kept reading. The final paragraph made my pulse quicken. The easement covered more than the access road. A detailed survey map was attached. I spread it across the desk. My eyes followed the highlighted boundary lines. The road. The entrance gate. A small utility corridor. Then something else. I leaned closer. The community mail station. I recognized it immediately. I'd passed it while driving toward the ranch. Rows of mailboxes beneath a decorative stone shelter. Every resident used it. According to the survey map, it sat inside the easement zone, not outside. Inside. I grabbed a ruler from the desk. Measured twice, then a third time, same result. The mail station wasn't on HOA-owned property. It sat on land covered by the expired agreement. A strange feeling settled over me. Not excitement, not victory. Something closer to disbelief. Because if the mail station was inside the easement boundary, how much else was? I pulled the attached survey closer. The answer wasn't reassuring. The highlighted area stretched farther than I expected, toward the subdivision entrance, toward several common-use facilities, toward property the HOA clearly treated as its own. I looked again at my grandfather's note. Open if questions ever arise about the East Road. He'd known. Maybe not about Linda Whitmore, maybe not about the HOA, but he'd known questions would eventually come, and he'd left the answer exactly where it could be found. I looked at the clock, then at the document, then at the county recording number stamped across the first page. One document wasn't enough. I needed confirmation. Current surveys. Current records, current filings, something official, something recent. Because if this easement truly expired 8 months ago, then the situation at my gate that morning wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something much bigger. I carefully returned the pages to the envelope. Then I reached for my phone. Tomorrow morning, I was going to the county recorder's office. And for the first time since Linda Whitmore had told me I was trespassing on my own land, I found myself asking a different question. Not whether she was wrong, but how many people were about to discover she was. The next morning, I walked into the county recorder's office carrying my grandfather's envelope and a notebook. I left 3 hours later with a problem much larger than an expired easement. The clerk helping me was efficient and thorough. Once I gave her the recording number from the agreement, she pulled every related filing tied to the eastern section of Mercer Ranch. There weren't many. That was the first surprise. The easement had been properly recorded 3 decades ago. Its expiration had been properly documented. What wasn't there mattered more. No renewal, no amendment, no extension, no replacement agreement, nothing. 8 months earlier, the easement had expired exactly as written. Legally, the rights granted through it had ended. The road, the utility corridor, the access privileges. All of it. I asked the clerk the same question 3 different ways. She gave me the same answer each time. No active easement is recorded. By noon, I had certified copies in my truck. By 1 o'clock, the first certified letter arrived. It was waiting in the mailbox outside the ranch house. Sender. Crest Hollow Estates, Homeowners Association. I already knew who it was from. I just didn't know how aggressive Linda Whitmore planned to be. Turns out, very. The Sanha letter accused me of unlawful entry onto HOA-controlled property. It assessed a trespass penalty of $3,500. There was also a $750 administrative fee. And a warning. Future violations could result in liens being filed against my property. I read the letter twice. Not because I was angry, because I wanted to understand how confident someone had to be to threaten liens over land they didn't own. At the bottom sat two signatures, Linda Whitmore and someone new, Brad Ellis. HOA Council. I folded the letter carefully, then placed it inside a growing folder on my desk. Evidence. The next move came faster than I expected. 2 days later, my phone started ringing. Unknown numbers, one after another. The first caller hung up. The second asked whether I was the ranch owner causing trouble with the HOA. The third informed me that local social media groups were discussing me. That afternoon, I found out why. A resident forwarded screenshots. Linda had posted an announcement inside the Crest Hollow Estates community page. According to her statement, an outside party was attempting to interfere with HOA property rights. The post described me as hostile, uncooperative, potentially dangerous to community interests. Hundreds of comments followed. Most supported her. Why wouldn't they? For years, she'd been the authority figure. I was a stranger. The interesting part wasn't the accusations. It was the language. Every sentence repeated the same assumption. HOA property, HOA land, HOA ownership. Not a single reference to deeds, titles, recorded easements. Just ownership stated as fact. I saved screenshots of everything. Then another letter arrived. This one came directly from Brad Ellis, the attorney. Unlike Linda's emotional language, Brad's letter was colder, more professional, more dangerous. He demanded written assurance that I would stop entering HOA-controlled areas. Failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. Trespass, interference, property damages if necessary. The message was clear. Back down. Instead, I hired a HOA surveyor. His name was Don Keller. 40 years of land surveying across Colorado. The kind of man who trusted measurements more than opinions. When I showed him the expired easement, he whistled softly. Interesting. That's one word for it. He spread the maps across the hood of his truck, studied them for 10 minutes, then looked at me. You want to know exactly what sits inside this easement boundary, every inch? He nodded. I'll have answers. That same week, survey crews arrived. Tripods, markers, GPS equipment, bright orange flags appearing along sections of the eastern boundary. The reaction from the subdivision was immediate. People watched from driveways. Others slowed their vehicles to stare. Some photographed the crews. News traveled fast inside HOA neighborhoods, apparently faster than facts. 3 days later, another envelope appeared. Another fine, another warning, another threat. This time, Linda accused me of interfering with HOA infrastructure through unauthorized surveying activities. I laughed out loud when I read that one. The survey wasn't on HOA land. That was the entire point. But Linda wasn't slowing down. She was accelerating, which told me something important. She didn't know. Not yet. Neither she nor Brad Ellis had checked the records. If they had, these letters would have stopped. Instead, they kept coming. Each one signed, dated, documented, each one becoming evidence. Then Don Keller called. His voice sounded different, focused, careful. Caleb. Yeah? You need to come look at something. Bad? A pause. No. Another pause. Actually, depending on your perspective, it might be very good. I grabbed my keys. What did you find? The surveyor exhaled slowly. Let's just say this isn't about a road anymore. My hand tightened around the phone, because suddenly the expired easement wasn't the biggest story, not even close. And whatever Don Keller had found on those maps was about to change everything. I met him at the eastern edge of the ranch an hour later. Survey markers stretched across the ground in bright orange lines. Stakes stood beside the access road. Small flags marked corners and boundaries that hadn't been examined this closely in decades. Don was standing beside the hood of his truck when I arrived. Several maps were spread across it. He didn't waste time. Take a look. I stepped beside him. The first map showed the original Mercer Ranch boundaries. The second showed the expired easement. The third showed Crest Hollow Estates as it existed today, layered together. Everything aligned. Everything became very clear. And very bad for the HOA, Don pointed at a highlighted section. The road sits inside the expired easement. I knew that. He nodded. Keep looking. His finger moved farther east toward the subdivision entrance, the decorative stone sign welcoming residents to Crest Hollow Estates, the landscaped median, the visitor parking area, all inside the easement boundary. I stared at the map, then at the actual entrance visible in the distance, then back to the map. That's not possible. Actually, it is. Don slid another survey toward me. A newer one. Certified. Stamped. Current. The developer expanded several common use areas years after the original easement was granted. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Without updating the legal boundaries. Exactly. He pointed again. The HOA entrance. The visitor parking lot. A maintenance storage shed. A decorative pond with a walking path around it. Every one of them sat inside land access rights that had expired 8 months ago. But Don wasn't finished. His finger moved farther down the page, toward a structure every resident used, the community mail station. Rows of clustered mailboxes protected beneath a stone shelter, the center of daily life inside the neighborhood. I looked at the measurements, then looked again. The numbers didn't change. The entire mailbox facility sat inside the expired easement. Every single box, every concrete pad, every inch. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because we both understood what that meant. The HOA wasn't simply using an old road. Their most important community assets were standing on land they no longer had legal rights to occupy. How certain are you? I finally asked. Don gave me a look. Surveyors hate that question. Certified survey. Fair point. He folded his arms. Want the really interesting part? I almost laughed. There's more? Oh yeah. He handed me another document. This one came from county permitting records. Several HOA improvements had been approved over the years. The pond, the parking expansion, the landscaping project, the mailbox shelter. Each permit described the land as HOA-controlled property. Not one referenced the easement, not one referenced Mercer Ranch, Not one referenced temporary access rights. The county had approved projects based on information supplied by the HOA. Information that apparently nobody had ever verified. I took a long breath. Linda Whitmore wasn't just mistaken. She'd built years of HOA operations on assumptions. And assumptions were fragile things when paperwork started showing up. My phone buzzed. Another email. Another message from the HOA. I opened it, then immediately handed it to Don. He read it. Whistled. She's doubling down. The message came from Brad Ellis. Formal legal language. Formal legal threats. The HOA demanded that all surveying activity cease immediately. Failure to comply would trigger additional penalties. There was even language about interference with community operations. I couldn't help smiling. Not because the threat mattered, because Brad Ellis had just put more assumptions in writing. Every letter, every email, every claim. The evidence folder on my desk was getting thicker. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed determined to keep feeding it. Don folded the email and handed my phone back. They know any of this yet? No. You planning to tell them? I looked toward the subdivision. A resident walked past the mailbox shelter carrying a package. Another drove through the entrance gate. Life was continuing normally. Nobody knew. Not yet. Linda certainly didn't. If she had, the letters would have stopped. The threats would have stopped. The entire strategy would have changed. Instead, she was escalating. And every escalation made the eventual fall worse. No, I said. I'm not telling them. Don raised an eyebrow. Why not? I looked down at the maps, then at the growing collection of documents in my truck, then toward Crest Hollow Estates. Because the truth was simple. I wasn't the one creating this problem. Linda Whitmore was. Every letter she signed, every fine she issued, every public statement she made, she was building a record, and records matter, especially when lawyers get involved. Let her keep talking, I said. Don stared at me for a moment, then slowly nodded. He understood. The power had shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but legally, quietly. The ground beneath Crest Hollow Estates had already started moving, only nobody inside the neighborhood knew it. As I loaded the surveys into my truck, a dark SUV pulled into the subdivision entrance. The driver slowed, watched us, then drove away. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This time there was a voicemail. I played it through the speakers. The voice belonged to a woman, older, careful, nervous, Mr. Mercer. My name is Maggie Dawson. A pause. Then, I live in Crest Hollow Estates. Another pause. Longer this time. I think you need to hear what Linda Whitmore has been doing to people. The voicemail ended. I stared at the screen. Because for the first time, this wasn't just a land dispute anymore. And whatever Maggie Dawson wanted to tell me might explain why so many people inside Crest Hollow Estates looked afraid whenever Linda Whitmore's name came up. I called her back that evening. She answered on the first ring. Mr. Mercer? Caleb is fine. There was a pause, then a quiet sigh. Can we meet somewhere outside the neighborhood? That told me plenty before we even spoke. We met the next morning at a diner off the highway. Maggie Dawson looked exactly like someone who had spent years trying not to attract attention. Early 70s. Neat clothes, careful posture. The kind of person who followed rules because life had taught her it was easier than fighting. She slid a folder across the table. I've been waiting for somebody to challenge Linda. I opened it. Inside were violation notices, dozens of them. Mailbox decoration violations, landscape violations, holiday decoration violations, fence color violations. Most were minor. The fines weren't. $300, $800, $1,200. One exceeded $4,000. I looked up. All this is yours. Some. She pointed to different pages. The rest belongs to neighbors who were too scared to come. That word stayed with me. Scared. Not frustrated, not annoyed. Scared. What? Maggie laughed without humor. Of becoming Linda's next project. Over the next hour, she told me how Crest Hollow Estates really worked. Officially, it was a community. Unofficially, it was Linda Whitmore's kingdom. Disagree with a board decision. Inspection notices started appearing. Question a fine. More violations followed. Challenge a rule? Lawyers got involved. The pattern repeated over and over. Most residents eventually stopped fighting. Not because Linda was right. Because fighting cost money. The folder contained proof. Then Maggie showed me something worse. A spreadsheet, printed from HOA financial records. Columns of addresses, fine amounts, outstanding balances, legal fees, collection charges. I studied it carefully. The numbers were staggering. Some residents owed thousands, others owed tens of thousands, and most of those balances originated from small violations that had snowballed through fees and penalties. Where did this come from? I asked. Annual disclosures. I looked at her. Residents get this? Technically. That one word carried a lot of meaning. Technically. The same way people technically have rights they never exercise. I kept turning pages. Then something caught my attention. A familiar address. Linda Whitmore's. I checked again, then again. Balance due, $0. Violation history, none. Late fees, none. Collection activity, none. Nothing. Not a single issue. For years. I looked up. That's interesting. Maggie nodded. Everybody noticed. The silence between us lasted several seconds. Because nobody runs an HOA for years without violating at least one of their own rules. Nobody. Yet somehow, Linda had a perfect record. Meanwhile, half the neighborhood seemed trapped in a cycle of fines. I copied the address information into my notebook. Then Maggie introduced me to someone else, a younger homeowner named Rachel Turner. We met later that afternoon. Rachel arrived carrying a cardboard box. She set it on the table between us. These are mine. Inside sat nearly 2 years of HOA correspondence, late notices, collection letters, violation reports, threats. The original issue? A decorative flower planter near her mailbox. A planter. The first fine had been $150. By the time legal fees and penalties were added, the balance exceeded $3,000. I stared at the paperwork. Rachel shook her head. I paid it. Why? Her answer came instantly. Because I was afraid they'd take my house. The room fell quiet. Not because I doubted her, because I believed her. That was the real damage, not the money. Fear. People changing behavior because they believed resistance was hopeless. Before leaving, Rachel handed me another document. This is why I wanted to meet. I unfolded it. A financial summary. Internal HOA accounting. One section had been highlighted. Discretionary Operations Fund. I read the numbers, then read them again. Over $200,000. Transferred from fines and penalties. The account required only one board signature for withdrawals. 1. I checked the authorization line. Linda Whitmore. My eyes narrowed. Where did you get this annual budget packet? Rachel's voice lowered. Nobody ever asks questions about it. I slipped the document into my folder. Because suddenly, the story was getting larger, much larger. The expired easement, the mailboxes, the road. Those were ownership issues. This was something different. This was money. And money attracts attention in ways property disputes sometimes don't. As I drove back toward the ranch that evening, another certified letter waited in my mailbox. Another demand from Brad Ellis. Another threat. Another claim that I was interfering with HOA property rights. I added it to the folder. Then I looked at everything spread across my desk. The expired easement, the survey maps, the HOA threats, the resident complaints, the financial records, the account controlled by Linda Whitmore. One folder had become 3, and every new document pointed in the same direction. The problem wasn't simply that Linda didn't own the land. The problem was that she had spent years acting like she owned everything. Then my phone buzzed. A community notice from Crest Hollow Estates had just been posted online. Emergency HOA meeting. All residents encouraged to attend. Topic: Protecting community property rights against outside threats. I stared at the announcement for several seconds, then smiled. Because I already knew exactly who the outside threat was, supposed to be. What interested me more was what Linda planned to say in front of an entire neighborhood, and whether she was about to hand me even more evidence. The meeting took place 3 nights later inside the Crest Hollow Estates Community Center. Every parking space was full. Residents stood along walls. Others sat in folding chairs facing a small stage where Linda Whitmore stood beside a projector screen. Brad Ellis occupied a seat near the front. He looked confident. The same confidence people tend to have when they believe nobody is checking their paperwork. I took a chair in the back row. Quiet. Unnoticed. At least for the moment. Linda started exactly how I expected. Our community is under attack. The words appeared on a slide behind her. Several residents nodded immediately. Fear is easier to sell when you've spent years convincing people you're their protector. She clicked to the next slide. Aerial photos. Roads. Neighborhood entrances. The mailbox station. The decorative pond. Everything I now knew sat inside an expired easement. Linda pointed toward the images. An outside party is attempting to challenge property rights that have belonged to Crest Hollow Estates for decades. The statement was direct, certain, and completely unsupported. I opened my notebook. The first thing I wrote down was the exact time, then her exact words. Because details matter, especially later. For 20 minutes, Linda spoke without interruption. According to her version of events, the HOA owned everything. The roads, the common areas, the entrance facilities, the mailbox station, the pond. Every claim was presented as established fact. No deeds, no title reports, no legal descriptions, just certainty. Then the questions started. A man near the center of the room stood first. "I have a question." Linda smiled. The controlled smile of someone expecting an easy exchange. "Of course." The man looked toward the projector. "Has anyone actually reviewed the deed records?" The room shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. People became interested. Linda's smile tightened. "Our legal team has thoroughly reviewed the matter." That wasn't an answer. The resident seemed to notice. "So that's a no?" A few people laughed quietly. Brad Ellis leaned forward. Linda moved on quickly. "Next question." A woman stood, middle-aged, serious. "Does the HOA have title insurance on these properties?" That one landed harder, because title insurance only exists when ownership has been verified. Linda hesitated. "Not long, but long enough." That's outside the scope of tonight's discussion. The room grew quieter. Questions like that tend to linger. I kept writing. Every response, every refusal, every statement. Then Linda made her mistake. The one that changed everything. A resident near the back asked why the HOA was spending money pursuing legal action instead of simply showing ownership documents. The question clearly irritated her. For the first time all evening, her composure cracked. She pointed toward the crowd, toward the room, toward everyone who lived there. Then she said, "Kidong. The community is being targeted by a predatory land speculator." Several people turned, looking around, trying to identify who she meant. Then her eyes found me, standing in the back, notebook in hand. The room followed her gaze. Dozens of heads turned. For a moment, nobody spoke. Linda didn't look surprised to see me. She looked angry. "That man," she said. Now everyone was staring. The individual responsible for these claims. The silence deepened. I remained seated. Didn't argue. Didn't interrupt. Didn't respond. Because she was doing exactly what I hoped she would. Talking. Into microphones. On a recorded meeting stream. Under official HOA procedures. Brad Ellis looked uncomfortable. For the first time all evening. He knew public accusations create records, and records create problems. Linda didn't seem to care. She continued. "This individual is attempting to take property from hundreds of families." Another statement. Another note in my notebook. Another sentence unsupported by evidence. Then something unexpected happened. A voice spoke up from the audience. "Maggie Dawson, can you show us the deed?" The room froze. Linda looked directly at her. Maggie didn't look away. For several seconds, nobody moved. Finally, Linda answered. "The ownership records are being handled by counsel." Again, not an answer. People noticed. You could see it happening. Confidence draining from the room. Questions replacing assumptions. Doubt replacing certainty. For years, Linda's authority had been enough. Now people wanted proof. And proof wasn't appearing. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Not because the questions stopped. Because Linda clearly wanted them to. Residents slowly filed toward the exits. Small conversations forming everywhere. Quiet. Concerned. Curious. The mood was different than when they'd arrived. Much different. Outside, I was halfway to my truck when someone called my name. I turned. Brad Ellis stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You enjoying this?" he asked. Interesting question. I considered it. No. He looked surprised. "I enjoy facts." His jaw tightened slightly. Then he nodded, as though he'd just confirmed something. "You're making a mistake." I almost smiled. Because that sentence would have carried more weight if he wasn't standing on land he couldn't prove his clients controlled. "We'll see." Brad studied me for a moment, then walked away. I watched him disappear back inside, thinking about the meeting, thinking about Linda, thinking about every statement she'd made. Then I opened my truck door. A notification appeared on my phone. New email. Sender: Brad Ellis. Subject: formal notice of intended litigation. I stared at the screen, then opened the message. The HOA was preparing to sue, exactly as I'd hoped. Because once lawyers carried this fight into court, every document would become public. Every claim would need evidence. Every assumption would face scrutiny. And for the first time since this started, Linda Whitmore was walking directly toward a battlefield where confidence wouldn't matter. Only paperwork would. The lawsuit arrived 6 days later. A process server handed it to me at the ranch house just after lunch. I already knew what it would say. The email from Brad Ellis had made that clear. Still, seeing the complaint in writing was something else. Crest Hollow Estates Homeowners Association versus Caleb Mercer, trespass, interference with HOA operations, damages, and a request for a court order permanently prohibiting me from entering what they called HOA-controlled property. I read the complaint twice, then a third time, not because it was complicated, because I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to go. The answer was very far. The filing repeatedly referred to the road, the mailbox station, the entrance facilities, and the common areas as HOA property. Not HOA managed, not HOA maintained. Owned. That word appeared over and over. Ownership, authority, control. The one thing missing was proof. No recorded deed, no active easement, no title, report. Nothing, just assertions. I placed the lawsuit beside the growing stack of letters on my desk. Then I started building my response. The first document came from the county recorder. Certified copies of the expired easement. The second came from Don Keller. His completed survey package arrived in a binder nearly 2 inches thick. Every boundary, every measurement, every improvement, every structure, professionally certified, impossible to ignore. The mailbox station alone occupied nearly half an acre of expired easement territory. The entrance sign sat inside the same zone. So did the visitor parking area, the pond, the walking path, the storage building. The more I reviewed the survey, the worse the HOA's position became. Then I added another piece, a title report. Not because I needed one, because I wanted absolute certainty. The title company delivered its findings 3 days later. The conclusion occupied a single page. Ownership of the underlying property remained with Mercer Ranch, no transfer of title had ever occurred. No recorded conveyance, no deed, no replacement easement, nothing. The land beneath the disputed facilities still belonged to the ranch. Legally, completely. I added the report to the evidence folder. By then it had become a filing box. The story wasn't fitting inside folders anymore. Meanwhile, Linda continued talking. That was the part I found most remarkable. The lawsuit hadn't slowed her down. If anything, it encouraged her. Screenshots continued arriving from residents. Community updates. Facebook posts, email newsletters. Everyone repeated the same claim. The HOA owned the land. At first, the statements irritated me. Then I realized something. Each one carried a date, a timestamp, a record. Evidence. Maggie Dawson understood it too. She called one evening. Have you seen the latest newsletter? Not yet. It says the HOA's ownership rights are unquestionable. I almost laughed. Did they really use that word? Twice. Interesting. Very interesting. Because now those statements existed alongside certified title reports proving the opposite. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. A few days later, I received another visitor. Sheriff Tom Raines. This time he came alone. No Linda, no HOA representatives, just the sheriff. He stood beside my truck and looked toward the eastern section of the ranch. Quite a situation. Seems that way. He nodded, then surprised me. I pulled the records myself. I looked at him and his expression remained neutral, but only barely. I couldn't find a deed either. That mattered. Because Tom Raines wasn't part of the dispute. He didn't care who won. He cared who was right. And apparently he'd reached the same conclusion I had. The sheriff glanced toward the subdivision. You expecting this to go to trial? Probably. He nodded again, then left. Simple conversation. Important consequence. Because if local officials were starting to ask questions, others would too. The hearing date arrived 2 weeks later. Not a full trial, just the first major court appearance. But it was enough. Enough to place every document under judicial review. Enough to force both sides into the open. Enough to make ownership more than neighborhood gossip. The night before the hearing, I sat at my desk reviewing everything one final time. The expired easement, the certified survey, the title report, the HOA letters, Linda's public statements, the meeting recordings, the financial records Maggie and the other residents had provided. A complete picture was forming. Not just of a property dispute. Of years of assumptions built on foundations nobody had bothered to verify. I closed the final binder, then looked at the hearing notice. For weeks, Linda Whitmore had controlled the battlefield. Neighborhood meetings, newsletters, threats, fine notices, public accusations. Tomorrow, that changed. Tomorrow, every claim would have to survive in a courtroom. And courtrooms have a habit of asking very simple questions. Questions that confidence alone can't answer. Questions like, where is the deed? The problem for Linda Whitmore was that, as far as I could tell, there wasn't one. And by this time tomorrow, everyone else might know that too. The hearing started at 9 o'clock sharp. Judge Caroline Vance entered the courtroom without ceremony, reviewed the docket, and immediately called our case. Crest Hollow Estates Homeowners Association versus Caleb Mercer. I stood. Brad Ellis stood. Linda Whitmore sat directly behind him. For the first time since this began, she looked slightly less certain than usual. Not worried, not yet, but no longer completely comfortable. Courtrooms tend to have that effect on people who are used to controlling the room. Judge Vance wasted no time. counsel for the plaintiff. Brad stepped forward. To his credit, he was organized, professional, confident. He outlined the HOA's position clearly. The association had maintained the disputed areas for decades. Residents relied on them. The HOA had invested money in them. The community viewed them as HOA property. He spoke for nearly 15 minutes. The words changed. The theory did not. Long-term control, long-term maintenance, long-term use. The judge listened carefully. Then she looked at me. Mr. Mercer. I stood and approached the podium. My position is considerably simpler, Your Honor. That got her attention. Judges appreciate simple. I handed copies of the survey, title report, and recorded easement to the clerk. Then I started with the document that mattered most. The easement. Recorded. Dated. Signed. County certified. I walked the court through the expiration clause. The judge followed along silently. Then I moved to the title report. Ownership remained with Mercer Ranch. No deed transfer, no conveyance, no replacement easement, no active legal right granting the HOA control over the disputed property. Then came the survey. The courtroom screens displayed the map. Colored boundaries appeared. Road, entrance sign, parking area, pond, walking path, mailbox station. Every major HOA improvement sat inside the expired easement zone. The room became noticeably quieter. Judge Vance studied the map for a long moment. Then she turned toward Brad Ellis. Counsel. Brad nodded. The judge asked a single question. Does the plaintiff possess a recorded deed establishing ownership of the disputed property? Simple, direct, precise. The entire case suddenly narrowed to one point. Brad looked down at his files, then opened another folder, then another. Paper shifted across the table. The courtroom became very still. I glanced toward the gallery. Maggie Dawson was there. Several residents sat behind her. They'd come on their own. No one spoke. Judge Vance waited. Brad continued searching. A minute passed. Then 2. Then 3. The silence became uncomfortable. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just unavoidable. Because everyone understood exactly what was happening. A question had been asked. An answer wasn't appearing. Finally, Brad stood. Your Honor, the HOA has documentation supporting its authority over the property. The judge didn't blink. That was not my question. The silence returned. Longer this time. Linda shifted in her chair. The first visible crack. Brad tried again. The association has exercised continuous control for many years, Judge. Vance folded her hands. Do you have a recorded deed? No one spoke. The answer had become obvious. Not because Brad admitted it, because he couldn't produce it. The quiet lasted nearly 5 minutes. 5 minutes of paper shuffling. 5 minutes of searching. 5 minutes of everyone in the courtroom realizing that the foundation of the HOA's entire argument might not exist. Then Brad sat down. Slowly. Carefully. Like a man who understood the situation had changed. Judge Vance reviewed the exhibits one final time. Then she spoke. The court finds no evidence establishing current ownership rights in favor of the plaintiff. Linda stared forward, motionless. The judge continued. The easement relied upon by the association expired according to its recorded terms. Another pause. The defendant has presented unchallenged title documentation supporting ownership of the underlying property. More silence. Then the ruling. The HOA's request for injunctive relief was denied. The trespass claim was dismissed. Just like that. Months of threats. Letters. Fines. Public accusations. Collapsed under a single question. Where is the deed? The answer had apparently been nowhere. The hearing ended shortly afterward. Residents slowly filtered from the gallery. Many looked stunned. Others looked angry. Several looked relieved, like they had suspected something was wrong, but never expected to see it confirmed. Brad Ellis gathered his files without speaking. Linda remained seated, staring at the survey map still displayed on the screen. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked completely out of moves, or so it seemed. I collected my documents, thanked the clerk, prepared to leave, then stopped. Because there was one thing I still needed to do. The lawsuit was over. The ownership question had been answered. But the practical reality remained. The mailbox station, the roads, the entrance facilities. Everything sitting on land controlled by Mercer Ranch. The HOA no longer had a legal dispute. It had a legal problem. And 2 days from now, every homeowner in Crest Hollow Estates was about to learn exactly what that problem looked like. The morning after the hearing, I met with a real estate attorney in Denver. Not because I needed representation. The ownership issue had already been settled. I needed something else. Precision. The certified notices had to be correct. Every sentence, every reference, every legal citation, because once they went out, there would be no taking them back. By noon, the final draft was complete. The document was straightforward. It explained that the recorded easement granting access to portions of Mercer Ranch had expired. It explained that the court had recognized the expiration. It explained that several HOA facilities, including the mailbox station, entrance features, visitor parking area, and pond, occupied land no longer covered by any active easement. Then came the part that mattered most. The HOA would be offered an opportunity to negotiate a new agreement. Until then, residents deserved to know the truth. Every homeowner would receive a copy. 312 envelopes, 312 certified notices, 312 identical surprises. I mailed them all the next day. By Friday morning, the reaction began. The first call came from Maggie Dawson. They're opening them right now. I looked out across the ranch from my porch. What are people saying? A short laugh. Mostly asking why nobody told them sooner. That was a fair question. By lunchtime, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Residents were talking, comparing notices, reading court filings, looking at public records. For the first time, many of them were examining documents instead of HOA newsletters. The difference was immediate. Facts have a way of changing conversations. Around 2 o'clock, another call came. Rachel Turner. You should see the Facebook group. I couldn't. I wasn't a member. She read some of the comments instead. Residents wanted answers. People were asking about the expired easement, the mailbox station, the lawsuit, the court ruling. Most importantly, they were asking why the board had never disclosed any of it. By evening, screenshots started arriving, dozens of them. The tone inside the community had completely shifted. A week earlier, many residents viewed me as the outsider Linda described. Now they were asking questions about Linda, questions about Brad Ellis, questions about the board, questions about money. Especially money. That part accelerated when Maggie forwarded another document. A budget report. Not the version residents usually saw. A detailed version. The one showing transfers into the discretionary operations account Rachel had mentioned. The account controlled by a single signature. Linda's. I compared it with other records. Then with the fine reports residents had provided. The numbers matched, and they were large. Very large. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had flowed through the account over several years. That didn't automatically mean wrongdoing, but it guaranteed scrutiny. Residents apparently reached the same conclusion. An emergency HOA meeting was announced less than 24 hours after the notices arrived. Attendance shattered previous records. According to Maggie, people were standing outside because there weren't enough chairs inside. Linda attempted to reassure everyone. It didn't work. Residents wanted documentation. They wanted explanations. They wanted records. The same things Linda had spent weeks refusing to provide. Now the requests were coming from her own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially not me. Late that afternoon, I drove past Crest Hollow Estates, not through it. Past it. The mailbox station sat exactly where it always had. Rows of boxes beneath the stone shelter. Ordinary, unremarkable, yet somehow it had become the center of everything. Because every resident had opened one of those boxes expecting bills, advertisements, and ordinary mail. Instead, they found the truth. And truths are difficult to put back into envelopes. As I slowed near the entrance road, I noticed something unusual. Several residents stood near the mailbox station talking in small groups, not arguing, discussing, comparing documents. Reading notices, asking questions. The atmosphere felt different, not fearful, awake. For the first time since I'd inherited the ranch, the conversation wasn't being controlled by the HOA board. It belonged to the homeowners. My phone rang. Maggie again. You were right. About what? People aren't angry about the easement. I frowned. What are they angry about? Her answer came immediately. That nobody told them. I thought about that after hanging up. Because she was right. The expired easement wasn't the real story anymore. Neither was the lawsuit. The real story was trust. And trust had started collapsing. The next morning, another development arrived. A formal notice from state regulators. Someone had filed a complaint requesting a review of HOA financial practices. Attached were supporting documents, fine records, budget summaries, account transfers. Recognized several pages immediately. The investigation wasn't open yet, but it was heading that direction. Fast. I set the notice beside the stack of court documents. The pile was getting impressive. Then I looked toward the eastern section of the ranch, toward the subdivision, toward the mailbox station that had delivered more than letters this week. It had delivered accountability. And from everything I was hearing, accountability was spreading through Crest Hollow Estates much faster than Linda Whitmore ever expected. The only remaining question was what residents would discover when they started following the money. Because if the property records had created this much chaos, the financial records might change the entire future of the HOA. They did. 3 weeks after the certified notices arrived, Crest Hollow Estates looked like a different community. Not physically. The same roads, the same houses, the same mailbox station sitting on ranch land. What changed was the conversation. Residents were asking questions. And unlike before, they weren't accepting vague answers. The state review became a formal investigation. Once investigators started requesting records, more documents surfaced. Budget reports, transfer authorizations, internal board communications, account statements. The Discretionary Operations Fund became the center of attention. For years, money collected through fines and penalties had flowed into the account. The amount surprised even me. More than $200,000. The investigators weren't interested in rumors. Neither were the homeowners. They wanted documentation. Receipts, approvals, paper trails. The same standard Linda Whitmore had spent years demanding from everyone else. Now, it was her turn. Maggie Dawson kept me updated. Nearly every evening she'd call with another development. Another resident asking questions. Another board meeting growing more uncomfortable. Another explanation that wasn't satisfying anyone. Then came the vote. The residents organized it themselves. An emergency membership meeting. Board leadership review. Attendance shattered every previous record. According to Maggie, people stood along walls, outside doors, and in hallways just to participate. Linda arrived expecting a fight. What she found was something worse. Numbers, votes, documents. The process lasted less than an hour. When the count was completed, the result wasn't close. Linda Whitmore was removed from her position as HOA president. The room reportedly became silent. Not celebratory, not angry, just quiet. The kind of silence that follows the end of something people thought would never change. Brad Ellis resigned 3 days later. His letter was brief, professional, carefully worded. No explanation, no defense, no attempt to justify the lawsuit. Just a resignation. The attorney who had threatened liens, lawsuits, and permanent restrictions simply disappeared from HOA affairs. Meanwhile, the new board began reviewing old enforcement actions. That process revealed another problem. Many fines lacked complete documentation. Some contained missing photographs, others lacked inspection records. Several appeared to have been approved without the supporting evidence required by HOA procedures. One by one, questionable penalties were reviewed, then voided. Rachel Turner called me after receiving the notice clearing her account. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. When she finally did, her voice cracked. I thought I'd be paying that forever. I understood. For her, it wasn't about money anymore. It was relief. The same thing happened throughout the community. Old balances disappeared. Collection actions were withdrawn. Families who had spent years living under threats suddenly found those threats gone. The effect spread quickly. By the time winter approached, Crest Hollow Estates had a new board, new legal counsel, and a completely different attitude toward governance. Then came the final piece. The lease. The HOA still needed access to the mailbox station, the roads, the pond, the entrance, facilities. None of that had changed. What changed was how the relationship worked. Instead of assumptions, there would be paperwork. Instead of claims, there would be agreements. The negotiations were surprisingly straightforward. The new board understood reality. The ranch owned the land. The community needed access. A fair lease solved both problems. We signed it 2 months after the court hearing. Everything was recorded properly. Every boundary, every responsibility, every payment, clear, transparent, legal, exactly how it should have been from the beginning. A few weeks later, I drove back to the eastern boundary of the ranch, the same place where this entire mess started, the same gate, the same road, the same stretch of land where Linda Whitmore had stood with Sheriff Tom Raines and informed me I was trespassing. I parked beside the fence and stepped out. The mailbox station was visible in the distance. Residents came and went normally, collecting mail, talking with neighbors, living their lives. The difference was that now they knew the truth. No confusion, no myths, no imaginary ownership claims. Just facts. I stood there for several minutes thinking about my grandfather. About the envelope hidden inside his files. About the note he'd left behind, open if questions ever arise about the East Road. Questions had certainly arisen, and the answers had been sitting in a folder the entire time. Paperwork. That's what it came down to. Not arguments, not threats, not authority. Paperwork. A recorded easement, a title report, a survey, a deed. The things that survive when opinions don't. My phone buzzed. A text from Maggie Dawson. Simple. Short. Thank you. I smiled and put the phone away. Then looked once more toward Crest Hollow Estates. Linda Whitmore had called the sheriff because she believed I didn't belong on my own land. Months later, every homeowner in the neighborhood knew exactly whose land they had been standing on. Not because I yelled, not because I threatened anyone, because the records said so. The gate stood open behind me. The road stretched toward the lake, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, there was nothing left to prove. Only one quiet fact remained. The surprise waiting in every mailbox had never been the notice. It was the truth. And once people finally received it, everything changed.
If there's one lesson in this story, it's that confidence is never a substitute for facts. Linda had authority, meeting lawyers, and years of people accepting her word. Caleb had something similar, rigorous surveys, and the patience to let the truth speak for itself. In the end, the turning point wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a type of document that showed that was utterly there all along. That's something worth remembering in life. Whether it's planned family matter, business, or a disagreement with a neighbor, rushing to conclusion rarely have. Taking the time to understand the facts, staying calm under pressure, and standing on solid ground can carry you farther than anger ever will. Sometimes dignity means holding your position quiet until evidence catch up. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where paperwork told a very different story than what people believe? If you have, write a yes in the comments. And if you think Caleb handled this the right way, through patience, evidence, and the law, type 2 below. I always enjoy reading your experience and perspectives. And if you enjoy stories about ranch life, property rights, quiet perseverance, and everyday people standing there round the right way, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories ahead, and I'd be glad to have you along for the journey.